The moon hung high in the ink-black sky, casting its cold, pale light through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks that loomed over the cemetery like silent sentinels. A cold wind whispered across the graveyard, sending the fallen leaves fluttering and swirling, their rustling sound the only movement in the otherwise still night. The cemetery, nestled on the outskirts of a forgotten town, seemed untouched by time, its gravestones weathered by the ages, their once proud inscriptions now blurred and eroded by the slow creep of decay. I stood at the edge of the graveyard, my breath forming thin clouds in the crisp night air, the only sign of life in a world otherwise dead and silent. My lantern swayed slightly in my hand, casting a warm, flickering glow over the stones before me. The scent of damp earth and moss clung to the air, both comforting and unsettling. This graveyard was my domain, my sacred place. For 20 years, I had been its sole keeper, maintaining the graves, guarding the quiet repose of those long gone. But tonight, something had changed. The stillness that had once brought me peace now felt oppressive, as if the very earth beneath my feet was trembling with anticipation. Something was wrong, something that gnawed at my soul, that kept me awake in the dead of night. For the past week, I had noticed something strange. Each morning, after filling a grave, I would return to find it disturbed, empty. At first, I thought it was an animal, some scavenger dragging the bodies away, but the pattern persisted, night after night. The graves I had carefully filled were being violated, their contents stolen. The dead were not resting. They were being taken. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Tonight, I would stay. I would watch. The gravel path crunched softly beneath my boots as I made my way deeper into the cemetery. My lantern flickered and danced across the faded tombstones, casting long, trembling shadows. The graves around me were old, some half buried beneath the earth, forgotten by time. The wind picked up, tugging at the twisted branches above, sending shadows skittering across the ground like fleeting phantoms. The moonlight, though bright, was dimmed by the gnarled trees that seemed to stretch and whisper their secrets to the night. I stopped when I reached the freshest grave, the one I had filled just hours ago. The soil, still soft and freshly packed, had been disturbed. The grave was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt beside the hole, my fingers brushing the earth. There was no mistake. Something, or someone, had taken the body. The sanctity of this place had been violated, and with it, something inside me shifted. I felt a deep unease, a tightening in my chest, a chill creeping up my spine. My hand instinctively went to the lantern, lifting it higher, hoping its light might push back the darkness that clung to the edges of my vision. But the wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in the air. Even the leaves had ceased their rustling, as if the cemetery itself were holding its breath. And then I heard it. A faint creak, a sound like the bending of an old rusty hinge. It came from beyond the row of stones, just beyond the mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery. My muscles tensed. Every instinct screamed at me that this was no ordinary trespasser. This was something different. I turned sharply, swinging my lantern in the direction of the sound. My heart raced as my eyes scanned the graveyard, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the quiet graves, empty witnesses to whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. But then I saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing at the edge of the graveyard, barely visible beneath the shroud of the oak trees. It was still, waiting, watching. My pulse quickened. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady, though my chest tightened with the rising fear. There was no response, only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant howl of a fox, its mournful cry breaking the silence like a distant wail. I stepped forward cautiously, my boots crunching against the gravel, my grip tightening around the lantern. With each step, my body tensed, my senses on high alert. I moved toward the figure, my eyes never leaving it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I drew closer. But when I reached the spot, the figure was gone. I stopped, my breath shallow and quick, my eyes darting across the cemetery, searching for any trace of movement. The hairs on my arms prickled. I wasn't alone. And then, from the shadows, a voice. Low, almost imperceptible, but undeniably clear, it whispered through the night, sending a chill crawling up my spine. "You shouldn't be here, Victor Hale." My blood ran cold. The voice was strange, yet somehow familiar, as though it had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Slowly, I turned toward the voice. Standing in the shadows was the figure. This time, I saw him clearly. Father Gideon. He was draped in dark robes, his face partially obscured by a hood, but the intensity of his eyes, cold, unblinking, shone through. Twin shards of ice piercing through the darkness. He radiated an aura of something ancient, something twisted, an otherworldly power that filled the space between us. Recognition dawned slowly, though it was accompanied by disbelief, a gut-wrenching unease. Father Gideon. The name had haunted the edges of my memory for years, whispered in rumors about a cult leader who had vanished long ago. The man who had lived in the shadows, feeding on the fear of those who spoke of him. The man who had been lost to the world. But here he was, standing before me, real, tangible, and menacing as the night itself. I tried to steady my voice, but it trembled in the face of his presence. "What are you doing here? What do you want?" Father Gideon smiled, faint, calculating. His eyes never left my face as he spoke softly, his voice like the wind, low, secretive, and full of dark promise. "You've been watching the graves, Victor. But you should know, not all things are meant to stay buried. Sometimes the dead are not as quiet as they seem." The ground beneath us shifted. The wind howled in response to his words. And in that moment I realized, this night, this graveyard, had become the stage for something far more terrible than I could have imagined. The silence of the dead had been broken. And it was Father Gideon who had broken it. The silence between us stretched, thick as a fog. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each rhythmic thud echoing in my ears like a drumbeat that refused to let me ignore the truth of what was unfolding. I tried to steady my breath, to hold my ground, but there was something unnerving in the way Father Gideon stood before me, calm and unyielding. He wasn't the man I once knew. No, this was a figure shrouded in shadow and dread, and the piercing cold in his eyes made it impossible to look away. The wind picked up again, howling through the cemetery as though the dead themselves were trying to break free from their graves. The ancient trees groaned under the pressure of the storm, their twisted branches creaking like the bones of the long dead. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something terrible. And then he spoke, his voice low but clear, slicing through the stillness like a knife. "You should have stayed away, Victor," he said, his words drenched in cold amusement. "But now that you've come this far, I suppose it's time you understood the truth." His words hit me like a blow to the chest, and I could feel the anger and confusion rising up in me, mixing with something else, something deeper, something darker that I couldn't put into words. "The truth?" I echoed, my voice shaky but defiant. "What truth? What have you done to this place? What is happening to the bodies?" Father Gideon smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. A smile that felt more like a threat than anything else. "It's simple, really," he said, his tone calm, almost casual. "I've been doing what any man would do when faced with the inevitable, seeking immortality." My stomach twisted in horror as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. I took a step forward, my mind racing as I struggled to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. "Immortality? You're talking about raising the dead, turning them into—" "Not raising, Victor," Father Gideon interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though sharing a dark secret. "Reanimating. I've discovered a way to bend the laws of nature, to manipulate the very fabric of life and death. These bodies, these souls, are merely the first step in what will be a new age." The implications of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. My body stiffened, and I felt a cold sweat break out along the back of my neck. I had always known there was something wrong with this place, but I had never imagined it was something like this. "You're using them," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "You're desecrating the dead, turning them into things." Father Gideon's laugh was soft, but it chilled me to the bone. "Things?" he repeated. "No, Victor, they are alive. Alive in a way that transcends the limitations of mortality. They are the vessels of a new existence, free from the frailty of flesh and the decay of time." The air around us grew heavier, thick with an energy I could feel in the pit of my stomach. I glanced back at the grave, the one I had filled only hours ago. The dark hole yawned open like the mouth of some hungry beast, and I felt my blood run cold. "And you," my voice caught, the words suddenly hard to form. "You want to use them to live forever." Father Gideon's eyes gleamed with a terrifying certainty, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Not just live forever, I will live forever," he corrected, his voice dripping with dark conviction. "I will transcend this fragile, fleeting existence. I will become a god of sorts, ruling not just over the living but over the dead as well. It's not just about immortality, Victor, it's about mastery. Mastery over life, over death, over fate itself." I wanted to scream, to tell him how mad he was, but I could barely breathe, let alone speak. "You're mad," I spat, my hands shaking with a mix of fear and rage. "You're playing with things you don't understand, things you can't control." Father Gideon's smile faded, and for the first time I saw the cold, unyielding mask of a man who had gone too far. "You would say that," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you don't know what I've discovered. You don't know what I've sacrificed." His voice dropped to a whisper, like the hiss of a serpent. "I have spent years, Victor, searching for the truth. I've delved into ancient texts, forbidden rituals, dark alchemy. I've sacrificed everything to unlock the secrets of immortality, and I have succeeded." The weight of his words settled over me, suffocating, and I realized he wasn't just talking about knowledge. He was talking about death, about the lengths he had gone to, the lives he had destroyed. And in that moment I knew the truth. "Sacrificed everything?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. You killed your own family, didn't you? You sacrificed them for this madness." Father Gideon's eyes flickered, and I could see the darkness there, the pain, the obsession, the destruction that had consumed him. He didn't deny it. Instead, he whispered, "I had to. The life I had, my wife, my child, was a fleeting illusion. They were nothing compared to what I could achieve. Nothing compared to the power I now wield. Do you understand, Victor? I've unlocked the door to a new world, and nothing will keep me from walking through it." The weight of his words crushed me, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. There was no remorse in his voice, no regret. Only the cold, terrifying conviction of a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And then, as if to confirm the nightmare that was unfolding before me, Father Gideon raised his hand and drew a ritualistic symbol in the air. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and I felt the air grow heavier, thick with the suffocating presence of something ancient and terrible. The trees above groaned, their branches creaking as though in warning. The lantern flickered in my hand, casting long, ghostly shadows across the gravestones. I looked around in horror. And that's when I saw them. Figures, emerging from the shadows of the mausoleums and crypts. At first, they were little more than shapes in the darkness, but as they drew closer, their forms became more distinct. They were the reanimated, the dead, walking. Their eyes were empty, their faces pale and mottled with the sickness of death. But there was something still alive in them. Something sentient, like a faint echo of their former selves. I took a step back, my heart racing. What are they? What have you done? Father Gideon stepped forward, his face lit by the eerie glow of the lantern. His smile was cold, triumphant. They are the future, Victor. They are the bridge between life and death. And you. His eyes locked onto mine with an unholy intensity. You are the final piece. You are the one who will help me perfect the process. You have the blood of this place in your veins. The same blood that flows through me. No, I whispered, my voice shaking, I won't help you. Father Gideon's smile twisted, but there was no mercy in it. You don't have a choice, Victor. You will join us, whether you like it or not. I staggered back, my mind racing. It was too late. The dead were rising. The earth itself was rebelling against nature's laws, and my true father, this twisted, unrecognizable figure before me, was the one leading this unholy revolution. His words echoed in my mind like the final, chilling note of a funeral dirge. You will be one of us, Victor. You will live forever, just like me. I followed Father Gideon into the earth's belly, the flickering lantern in my hand, casting trembling shadows that stretched and recoiled as we descended deeper. The air around me grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something fouler, an unmistakable odor of decay, of rot. Every step I took echoed down the narrow, winding staircase, the faint scraping sound against the cold, rough stone sending a shiver up my spine. It felt as if the very rock beneath my feet was alive, watching us, pulsing with some malevolent energy. The deeper we went, the darker it became. The light from my lantern flickered wildly, caught in the drafts that whispered through the narrow passageways. It was as though some unseen force was toying with the flame, pushing it to its limits, making the shadows dance and stretch in grotesque shapes. My breath quickened as a tremor ran through my chest, my mind racing to process what was happening. I had no idea such a place even existed beneath the cemetery, the place I had spent my life tending, keeping the dead in their graves. Father Gideon, ahead of me, walked with a slow, deliberate pace. His dark robe trailed behind him like the tattered remnants of a phantom. Each step he took seemed purposeful, measured. This was a man who had long since shed any fear of what lurked in the shadows. The unsettling part was not the dampness, nor the twisting tunnels. It was the stillness in the air. There was no sound, no echo of our footsteps. The very depths of the earth seemed to swallow everything before it could escape, leaving us in a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Finally, we reached the bottom of the staircase. The last of the lantern's glow illuminated a large, arched doorway. Beyond it lay a vast chamber. As Father Gideon pushed the door open, a cold, stale air hit me in the face. as if I were stepping into the very bowels of the earth itself. The room that lay before me was far worse than I could have imagined. Not the damp, cave-like chamber I had expected, but something far more disturbing, more unnatural. The chamber was vast, far larger than I anticipated. The ceiling arced high above us, lost in shadow. The walls, etched with strange symbols and runes, seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly glow, casting a faint blue light over the room. The floor beneath my feet was stone, cracked in places and worn by time, but it was what filled the space that left me frozen in place. Rows upon rows of stone tables lined the room, and on each table there lay a body, or rather, what was left of a body. Some were skeletal, others still held the faintest traces of flesh, mottled and decaying, but none of them were truly dead. They twitched slightly, their limbs stiff, their faces slack, their eyes open, vacant, empty, but alive. The air grew thick, suffocating with a heaviness that tightened around my chest, like a weight pressing on me from all sides. The room felt alive with death, with something grotesque and unnatural. The faintest sound of breath, a soft rasping, echoed off the stone walls. But there was no visible source. The very atmosphere hummed with a dark energy, an unsettling presence that gnawed at my sanity. These bodies, they weren't corpses. They were something else, something I couldn't comprehend. Father Gideon stepped into the room, his voice low, filled with a strange pride. "This is where it all happens, Victor. This is where the line between life and death blurs. These bodies, these vessels, are not simply reanimated, they are reborn, brought back from the brink of oblivion to walk the earth once more." My breath caught in my throat as my eyes flicked from body to body, each one more disturbing than the last. These weren't corpses in the traditional sense. They were changed, twisted. Each one had the eerie quality of something that should not exist, something that had been forced back into the realm of the living at a horrific cost. Their skin, pale and stretched over bones, had a translucent quality, a sickly sheen that glowed in the flickering lantern light. And their eyes, though vacant, seemed to track my every movement, as if aware of my presence but unable to escape their unnatural state. "What have you done to them?" I managed to choke out, my voice thick with disbelief. This isn't resurrection. It's a mockery of life." Father Gideon's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. "Mockery? No, Victor, it is perfection. The human body is fragile, fleeting, but the soul—" His voice dropped to a reverent whisper. "The soul is boundless. I have learned to bind the two, to free them from their mortal constraints. These are the future. This is the new way of being. They are no longer slaves to decay, no longer slaves to time." My skin crawled as I glanced over the chamber, unable to tear my eyes away from the twisted tableau before me. My mind struggled to comprehend the enormity of what I was seeing. This wasn't just some ritual gone wrong. This was something far worse. These bodies had been raised, but they weren't human anymore. They were husks, empty vessels, driven by something dark and unnatural. And yet, in their eyes, I saw the faintest flicker of sentience. The horror of it gnawed at me. Father Gideon continued, oblivious to my growing terror. "You see, Victor, immortality is not a gift to be handed out freely. It is something to be earned, something to be controlled. The bodies I have reanimated are merely the beginning of a much grander vision. You, my son, are the key." My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled to breathe. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why me? Why are you telling me all of this?" Father Gideon turned to face me. his dark eyes gleaming with an eerie intensity in the dim light. "Because you, Victor, are the blood of this place. You are my flesh and blood, the heir to a lineage far older than you can imagine. This cemetery, this land, it is not just soil. It is a gateway, a bridge between worlds. And you are the one who will help me unlock it fully." The words crashed over me, drowning me in a cold, suffocating reality. My father. The thought seemed impossible, surreal, but the truth was becoming undeniable. The man before me, the man I had thought long lost, was not just a cult leader, a madman. He was the culmination of a twisted legacy, and I was now part of it. Father Gideon reached out, his cold fingers brushing my arm. The touch was ice, sending a jolt of terror through me. "You will help me, Victor. You will help me perfect the process. Together, we will transcend this existence, and we will walk forever, unbound by the chains of mortality." My stomach churned, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. I could not, would not, be a part of this madness. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my body refused to move. The sight of the bodies on the tables, their hollow eyes tracking my every move, was too much. The cold dread that gripped my heart was suffocating. Father Gideon's voice, soft and insistent, filled the room, each word a nail in my coffin. "Join me, Victor," he whispered. "You are my son. You were always meant to walk this path with me." But deep in my heart, something snapped. This was not the father I had known. This was something far worse. The man before me was a stranger, a monster, and I could not, would not, become like him. The eyes of the dead followed me, their vacant gazes burrowing deep into my soul. I was already in too deep. There was no turning back. The chamber grew colder still as Father Gideon's grin widened, the promise of something eternal glimmering in his eyes. The altar at the center of the room pulsed with dark energy, the room vibrating with the power summoned. And in that moment I knew. The question was no longer if I could escape, but how much of my humanity would I lose in the process? The air in the underground chamber felt thick, pressing down on my chest, each breath harder than the last. I couldn't seem to draw enough air to fill my lungs, each inhale a struggle as the reality of where I was sank in. My mind spun in a vortex of confusion and horror, trying desperately to make sense of the nightmare I had stumbled into. The walls seemed to close in around me, pulsing with a low, rhythmic hum from the altar at the center of the room, vibrating through the soles of my boots, making every muscle in my body hum with an unnatural tension. The very stone beneath my feet seemed to be alive, watching, waiting. The figures on the tables, pale, twitching husks, seemed to grow more animated with every passing moment, their limbs jerking involuntarily. They were waiting for something, I realized with a sickening jolt. They were waiting for the final spark of life to ignite within them. My pulse quickened, and I felt my stomach churn in horror. These weren't corpses, they were something else, something far worse. I looked around, my gaze flickering from body to body, feeling the weight of each stare. Their eyes, empty, lifeless, seemed to track my every movement, as if they knew I was there but could do nothing about it. The flickering lantern light cast long, grotesque shadows on the stone walls, twisting the already eerie atmosphere into something even more oppressive. But none of it seemed as suffocating as Father Gideon's presence, looming before me like a shadow cast over everything. My voice was thick with disbelief, my throat tight with a mixture of fear and fury. You've done this to them, to all of them." My words barely escaped as I tried to comprehend the enormity of the horror in front of me. Father Gideon's face, illuminated by the dim lantern glow, was unreadable. A mask of cold detachment. His expression never wavered as he took a step forward, his boots clicking softly on the stone floor. Every movement he made was measured, controlled. He wasn't a man anymore, he was something else entirely. Not done, Victor, created. He spoke as though he were explaining something simple, something obvious. You don't understand, do you? These aren't just bodies, these are vessels, containers for something greater. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to get out of here, I had to leave. But my legs felt rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place as the reality of the situation set in. This isn't life, it's not even close. This is death twisted beyond recognition. Father Gideon's lips curled into a smile, but there was no humor in it, only cold, ruthless amusement. This is what you fail to see, my son. This is life perfected. I have learned the secrets that the world has long since forgotten. His eyes gleamed in the dim light. The body is nothing, nothing, without the soul. The soul is eternal, unbound by flesh or time. These bodies, they are simply the vessels for those souls to return to the realm of the living. And with each reanimation, the power grows stronger. The process, refined over centuries, will allow us to transcend this mortal coil, to truly live forever. I shook my head, the revulsion in my stomach growing with every word he spoke. You're insane, I rasped. The words felt bitter on my tongue. These people, they are dead. What you've done to them, what you're doing, this is not resurrection, this is abomination. Father Gideon tilted his head, considering my words. I told you before, Victor, you do not understand. His gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing, and a chill ran down my spine. These souls are not gone. They have merely been dormant, waiting. I am their shepherd. I have brought them back, given them purpose, given them eternity. The horror was overwhelming, suffocating. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. But at what cost? You've stolen their souls. You've twisted them into this. I gestured toward the pale, twitching forms on the tables. How can you not see that? How can you live with yourself? Father Gideon's smile faltered, replaced by something more chilling, something dark, calculating. You speak of cost, Victor, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But you don't know what it means to sacrifice for power, for immortality, to take what was given and mold it into something greater. I know the price, and it is a price I would pay again and again, for eternity. His words settled over me like a death sentence, and I felt the weight of it press against my chest. The very air in the chamber grew heavier, suffocating, as if the stones themselves were closing in on me. The truth was unraveling, and it terrified me. This was no mere cult leader's twisted ambition. It was something far older, far more dangerous. A force that had been brewing beneath this town for generations, and now I was caught in its grasp. You killed your own family, I said softly, the weight of the revelation sinking into my bones. For this, for immortality, you killed them. You killed your wife and your child. Father Gideon's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something in them, an emotion, perhaps regret, sorrow. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the icy resolve of a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He stepped closer, and the air between us grew colder, thicker with dread. I had no choice, he replied, his voice low and detached, almost sad. They were nothing compared to what I have become, nothing compared to the eternity that awaits me. To us. He gestured around the room, as if encompassing everything, The figures on the tables, the altar at the center, the entire unholy process. They didn't understand, Victor, but you will. You'll understand soon enough. You are my blood. You are the key to unlocking the final step of the process. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. No, I won't help you. I won't be a part of this. You're not my father anymore. You're a monster. Father Gideon didn't even flinch. His eyes never wavered from mine, and his expression remained unwavering, cold. "You are my son," he said softly, his voice almost affectionate. "And you will help me, because you are the only one who can. You carry the blood of our lineage, of this land, the blood that has the power to complete the transformation, to bind the soul to the body, to break the barrier between life and death forever." My mind screamed in protest, the weight of his words suffocating me. The bloodline, my blood. I had always known something was different about me, something buried deep within my past. But this was beyond comprehension. This connection to the cemetery, to the land. It had all been part of some ancient plan, a plan that had been set into motion long before my birth, and I had been unknowingly groomed for this moment. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "I won't be part of this madness. You can't make me." Father Gideon's lips twisted into a cruel smile, and for a moment his voice seemed almost affectionate. "You have no choice, Victor. The process has already begun. The blood runs through your veins, just as it runs through mine. You are a part of this, whether you accept it or not, and in time you will understand. In time, you will come to see the truth." My heart raced as I stumbled backward, the chamber seeming to spin around me. The bodies on the table shifted in my vision, their hollow eyes tracking my every movement. The lantern flickered erratically in my trembling hand, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. It felt as if the very air around me was pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You will join us, Victor," Father Gideon's voice echoed, soft but certain, as the dark energy in the room pulsed and thrummed with power. "You will walk with us through eternity." The truth settled over me like a suffocating shroud. I was already caught in this twisted game. My fate was sealed. There was no escape from what had been set into motion long before my birth. And worse still, I realized, I wasn't just a victim in this game. I was the key. And the key, I understood with a gut-wrenching certainty, could never be turned back. The silence in the chamber pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. Each breath was harder than the last, as if the air itself had conspired to trap me. My mind was a blur of disbelief, my skin crawling with the cold truth that was taking root in my chest. The man before me, Father Gideon, was not merely a cult leader, not a madman. No, he was something far darker, a force, an ancient and terrifying force that had been shaping my life from the shadows for years. The price of immortality was far higher than I had ever imagined. And it was a price that had already been paid, a price I could never escape. Father Gideon stepped closer. The sound of his boots echoed in the stillness, breaking the silence like the toll of a bell. His face was unreadable, his eyes cold, eyes that seemed to already know the end of this story, eyes that told me he had already won. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was something else. Something far older, something that embodied fate itself. A twisted, malevolent version of it. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a desperate plea for escape, for a way out of this nightmare. I glanced around the chamber, my gaze landing on the bodies lining the stone tables. Some of them were dead, others barely clinging to life, their hollow eyes following my every movement. The air was thick with the foul stench of decay and something far worse. Something that made my skin crawl and my thoughts race in terror. "You're already one of us, Victor." Father Gideon's voice broke through the noise in my head, low and insistent, like a venomous whisper in the dark. "You always have been. Your bloodline was never meant to fade away, to die. It was meant to be eternal. And I've simply helped it along." I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. Panic twisted in my gut, but I couldn't move. It felt as if some invisible force had bound my soul, trapping me. Father Gideon's words echoed in my mind, rattling around like chains, wrapping tighter and tighter around my heart. "What do you want from me?" I managed, my voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "I don't understand. I'm not like you. I won't be a part of this madness." Father Gideon smiled, a cold, calculating smile that seemed to make the room grow even darker. "You are already part of it, Victor. You've been a part of it from the moment you were born. You can't deny it now. Your blood, your heritage, it's all tied to this place, to me, to what we're creating here." His eyes gleamed with hunger, as he swept his gaze over the bodies on the tables. "These are the vessels. They are empty now, but they will be filled with the souls of the chosen, and you are the final step in the process." My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the madness Father Gideon spoke of. Immortality had always been a myth, whispered about in the darkest corners of ancient texts. A thing of legend, but here, in this room, it was real. The dead were being forced to return, to live again. But at what cost? These bodies, these husks, were not being returned to their rightful owners. They were nothing more than empty shells, waiting for something to fill them. And what would that something be? A dark, twisted force that had no place in the natural world. My stomach churned as the horrifying realization set in. Father Gideon wasn't just talking about immortality. He was talking about using me. He was asking me to complete the ritual, to be the final key, the blood that would bind the souls to the bodies, granting him the immortality he so desperately craved. "You don't understand," I whispered, my voice thick with the weight of the realization. "You can't control this. You don't know what you're dealing with." Father Gideon's smile deepened, and there was no kindness in it, only cold triumph. "I understand more than you think, Victor. I've spent my life searching for this power. I've sacrificed everything for it, everything. And now it is within my grasp. And you—" His voice softened, a chilling affection creeping into his words. "You are the last piece, the bloodline, the sacrifice. You will complete the circle." My pulse raced, and the weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, the sound of blood rushing in my ears as though it were no longer my own. Father Gideon stepped closer, his cold fingers brushing my shoulder with an unnatural strength. His touch was ice, sending a jolt of terror through me. "You will help me, Victor," he said, his voice now thick with dark promise. "You have no choice. This is your destiny. The blood that runs in your veins is the last key. Without it, the process cannot be completed. Without you, I will not be able to ascend." My stomach twisted violently, and I could feel the weight of the choice hanging in the air like a guillotine's blade. His words were an iron grip around my throat, suffocating me, making me feel smaller, weaker, more helpless than I had ever felt in my life. "I won't," I spat, my voice raw with defiance. "I won't let you use me. I won't let you kill me again." Father Gideon's face darkened, his smile faltering for the first time. For a moment, his eyes flashed with something cold and dangerous. "It is not death, Victor. It is rebirth," he said, his voice dropping to a low, almost reverent whisper. You will become something greater. You will join me in this eternal life, in this unbroken cycle. We will rule together, Victor, forever." I recoiled, shaking my head violently. The weight of the decision threatened to crush me. My blood burned in my veins, my body frozen in fear and uncertainty. The price of immortality was too steep. The cost wasn't just my soul, it was my very essence, the core of who I was, everything that had made me me. And yet, the more Father Gideon spoke, the clearer it became. The pull of immortality clawed at me, promising eternal life, power beyond imagining. It was intoxicating. But the more I fought against it, the clearer it became. There was no escape. The choice had already been made for me. This was my fate, whether I accepted it or not. Father Gideon's hand tightened on my shoulder, the pressure like iron. "You will join us, Victor, and when you do, you will never again fear death. You will never again fear time. You will be eternal." My vision blurred as my pulse quickened. The room spun around me. I wanted to scream, to tear myself away, to fight against the fate being thrust upon me. But it was too late. There was no escape from what had already been set in motion. The price of immortality had been paid, and it was my life, my soul, that would be the final payment. Father Gideon smiled, and I felt the cold hands of eternity begin to close around me, pulling me into the dark promise of something that would never end.